My name is Alex Carter, and I'm 31 years old. For most of my life, my name hasn't meant much. It hasn't carried the weight of my father's, a man who built a construction empire from the ground up, or my brother's, a man groomed to inherit it all. My name was just Alex, the graphic designer, the creative one, the one who, in my family's unspoken language, meant the one who would probably always need a little help. But 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday so painfully ordinary I can't even remember what I had for lunch, that all changed. It happened under the fluorescent hum of a 7-Eleven, with a crumpled piece of paper I almost threw away. I won the Powerball. Not a small prize, not enough to pay off my student loans and maybe buy a new car. I won the whole thing, the sole winner of a $190 million jackpot. After taxes, and after taking the lump sum, it came out to just over $88 million. A number so large, so fundamentally absurd, that my brain couldn't even process it. I remember staring at the ticket under the dim light of my desk lamp in my tiny, overpriced Los Angeles apartment, my hands shaking so violently I had to pin the ticket to the table. The numbers stared back at me, a perfect, impossible sequence that held the power to rewrite my entire existence. My first thought wasn't about quitting my job, or buying a mansion in the Hollywood Hills, or traveling the world. My first thought, a cold and immediate instinct, was, I can't tell anyone, not a soul, especially not my family. You see, money in the Carter family isn't just currency. It's a language. It's a measure of worth, a tool for control, and a scoreboard for love. And for my entire life, I've been on the losing side of that game. Before I get into how I made the most life-altering decision, not just to hide my newfound wealth, but to use it in a way no one could ever see coming, I want to connect with you. If you're watching this, drop a comment and let me know what city or state you're tuning in from. I want to see how far this story reaches. And if you've ever felt like the underdog in your own family, if you know what it's like to be constantly underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Because what I'm about to share isn't just a story about money. It's a story about what happens when the person everyone counts out finally gets to hold all the cards. To understand why I chose secrecy, you have to understand the world I came from. My father, Richard Carter, is the quintessential American success story. He started with a single pickup truck and a toolbox, and through sheer force of will, built Carter Construction into one of the biggest commercial developers in Southern California. He's a man who believes in hard work, tangible results, and the unwavering superiority of his own opinions. He loves me, I think, in his own way, but he has never once understood me. My choice to become a graphic designer was, in his eyes, a frivolous and irresponsible detour from a real career. He saw my passion for art and design not as a skill, but as a hobby that I stubbornly insisted on turning into a profession. You can't build a legacy with pixels and fonts, Alex, he'd say over countless steak dinners, his voice laced with a disappointment that was sharper than any criticism. You build it with steel and concrete. My older brother, Mark, is the son my father always wanted. At 36, he's the executive vice president of Carter Construction, a role he stepped into right after getting his MBA from a prestigious university that my father's donations probably helped him get into. Mark embodies the company's ethos. He's sharp, ruthless, and wears his ambition like a tailored suit. He drives a Porsche, lives in a sprawling, minimalist house in Malibu, and treats me with a kind of patronizing pity that's almost worse than my father's outright disapproval. To Mark, I'm his well-meaning but hopelessly lost little brother, a creative type who just doesn't grasp the complexities of the real world, a world he defines by stock portfolios and profit margins. Our conversations are always the same. He'll ask how my little art projects are going, a dismissive term for my freelance business that I had painstakingly built from scratch, a business that barely kept my head above water in one of the most expensive cities in the world. Then there's my younger sister, Chloe. At 27, She's a self-proclaimed wellness influencer and aspiring actress who perpetually lives in a state of beautiful, chaotic crisis. She's the baby of the family, and she's mastered the art of weaponizing her vulnerability. Her life is a constant whirlwind of auditions that almost landed, yoga retreats that were supposed to be life-changing, and apartment leases she can't quite afford. I'm the one she calls, not Dad, because his help comes with a lecture. Not Mark, because his help comes with condescension. She calls me because my help has always come with no strings attached, even when it meant I had to eat instant noodles for a week to cover her emergency car payment. I've drained my meager savings for her more times than I can count, always with the promise that she'd pay me back as soon as she landed her big break. The big break never came, and neither did the money. This was the ecosystem of my family. I was the reliable, underachieving, and financially fragile cog in their machine. The one they could turn to for a small loan or a free logo design, but never for a serious opinion on something that mattered. I was the family's designated soft touch. My life before the lottery was a constant, grinding hustle. I worked a full-time job at a mid-sized marketing agency for a salary that was laughable in Los Angeles, and then spent my nights and weekends grinding on freelance projects just to make rent. My apartment was a 500 square foot box in Koreatown with a window that looked out onto a brick wall. My 2-year-old Honda Civic made a concerning rattling noise every time I went over 50 miles per hour. I was drowning in student loan debt, and my credit card balance was a source of constant, low-grade anxiety. I wasn't unhappy. Not exactly. But I was tired. I was tired of the relentless financial pressure, and I was tired of feeling like a disappointment to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Buying a lottery ticket was my one small act of rebellion, my $2 weekly investment in a fantasy. My family mocked me for it. Dad would quote the statistics on my chances of winning, calling it a tax on the mathematically challenged. Mark would joke that I'd have a better return on investment by just giving him the $2. But for me, it was never about the odds. It was about the brief, shimmering possibility of freedom, the chance to escape the quiet desperation of my life. I never actually expected to win. It was a dream, a fiction I let myself indulge in, until it wasn't. Until that crumpled piece of paper in my hand became the single most powerful object I had ever touched. As I sat there that night, the reality of the $88 million began to sink in, and a strange, cold clarity washed over me. This money didn't just change my financial situation. It changed everything. It was a truth serum, a magnifying glass that would reveal the true nature of every relationship I had. And I realized, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that if I revealed this secret, the Alex Carter they knew would cease to exist. I would be replaced by a walking, talking ATM, a solution to all their problems, a target. And the quiet, simmering resentment I had buried for years began to bubble to the surface. What if, for once, I was the one in control? What if I could finally find out who these people really were, stripped of their power and their expectations of me? An idea began to form in my mind, a dangerous, elaborate, and perhaps cruel experiment. I would keep the money a secret. And then I would go to my family, one by one, not as a secret millionaire, but as the person they'd always believed me to be, desperate, struggling, and in need of their help. The days following my lottery win were a blur of surreal paranoia and meticulous planning. I didn't sleep for nearly 72 hours, my mind racing with the infinite possibilities and the crushing weight of my secret. The winning ticket sat in a fireproof safe I bought on Amazon, which was hidden inside a hollowed-out textbook on my bookshelf. It felt like holding a live grenade. Every phone call made my heart leap into my throat, irrationally expecting a stranger from the lottery commission to be on the other end. Every knock on my apartment door felt like a potential threat. I was living in a state of high alert, an anonymous millionaire disguised as a struggling graphic designer. My first real step was to seek professional help, but not the kind you might think. I didn't go to a flashy financial advisor in Century City. Instead, I found a small, discreet law firm in Pasadena that specialized in high net worth individuals who valued privacy above all else. I paid for the initial consultation in cash and gave them a fake name. I sat across from a man named Arthur Vance, a lawyer in his late 60s with kind, tired eyes and a mind like a steel trap. I laid out my hypothetical situation. "Let's say," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "a client of yours, a single man with no spouse or children, came into a significant, life-changing amount of money. And let's say his primary concern was not how to invest it, but how to claim it without a single person in his life finding out." Arthur didn't even blink. He'd clearly heard variations of this before. He explained the process of setting up a blind trust, an LLC, and a series of legal firewalls that would make my identity as the winner nearly impossible to trace. "The biggest mistake winners make," he told me, his voice a low, steady rumble, "is underestimating the corrosive power of sudden wealth. It changes people, Alex. Not just the winner, but everyone around them. Greed is a powerful, primal force." His words solidified my resolve. My instinct to hide the money wasn't just paranoia, it was self-preservation. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with Arthur's firm to legally and anonymously claim my winnings. We established the North Star Trust, a name I chose because it felt like a guide in the darkness of my uncertainty. The money was wired, the taxes were paid, and suddenly my net worth went from being negative $30,000 to a positive $88 million. Yet, on the outside, nothing changed. I still drove my rattling Honda to my underpaying job. I still ate cheap takeout. I still haggled with my freelance clients over a $50 difference in project fees. The secrecy was a heavy cloak, and I was starting to feel the strain of living a double life. But the experiment, the test I had conceived in the initial shock of my win, was taking shape. It was no longer a vague idea. It was becoming a concrete plan, a script I was writing for the most important performance of my life. I needed a believable crisis. It had to be something serious enough to warrant asking for a significant amount of money, but not so catastrophic that it would seem completely out of the blue. I decided to build the story around my freelance work, the part of my life my family already viewed as unstable. The narrative I crafted was this. My biggest freelance client, a tech startup that accounted for nearly 70% of my side income, had folded overnight. They had failed to secure a new round of funding, declared bankruptcy, and wouldn't be paying their outstanding invoices, which included over $10,000 they owed me. To make matters worse, my full-time job had just announced cutbacks, reducing my hours and salary by 20%. The combination of these two events would leave me in a desperate position, unable to make my rent for the upcoming month, and facing eviction. The amount I would ask for was crucial. It had to be a real stretch, a genuine sacrifice for anyone who might help. I settled on $7,500. It was enough to cover my back rent, my security deposit on a new, cheaper apartment, and basic living expenses for a month while I scrambled to find more work. It was also an amount that I knew every member of my immediate family could afford to give me, or at least lend me, without it significantly impacting their lifestyle. I made a list, a hierarchy of who to approach first. It felt cold and calculating, like I was ranking my family members based on their capacity for compassion. I decided to start at the top, with the person who had the most, and, I suspected, would give the least, my father. I rehearsed the conversation in my head 100 times, practicing the exact tone of desperation mixed with shame. I had to sound like the son he always thought I was, talented but financially incompetent, hitting a predictable roadblock on my misguided career path. I waited until a Wednesday evening, a time I knew he'd be home from work, likely in his leather-bound study, sipping a glass of expensive scotch and reviewing blueprints. My heart hammered against my ribs as I dialed his number. It felt like I was calling to confess a crime, not ask for help. He answered on the second ring, his voice booming and impatient. Richard Carter. He never said hello. Dad, it's Alex, I said, pitching my voice to sound defeated. There was a pause. Alex, everything all right? You sound terrible. The opening was perfect. I launched into my meticulously crafted story, weaving in details about the startup's arrogant CEO, the suddenness of the bankruptcy, the cold, impersonal email that had informed me I wouldn't be paid. I described the cutbacks at my day job, the panic of looking at my bank account and seeing nothing but fumes. I let my voice crack when I talked about the eviction notice. I was acting, but the emotions I was channeling were real. They were the echoes of a decade of genuine financial anxiety. When I finished, the line was silent for a long moment. I could hear the clinking of ice in his glass. Well, son, he finally said, and the sigh that followed was heavy with a familiar disappointment. I hate to say I told you so, but this is the exact reason I warned you about relying on that freelance nonsense. It's not a real business. It's fickle. There's no stability. He wasn't offering sympathy. He was scoring points in a decade-long argument. I know, Dad, I said, swallowing my pride. You were right. But right now, I'm in a real bind. I need help. I need to borrow $7,500. Just to get back on my feet. I'll pay you back, every penny, as soon as I can. The silence that followed was even longer this time. It stretched for what felt like an eternity. I could almost hear the calculations happening in his head. Not financial calculations, but a cost-benefit analysis of my failure. Alex, you know I believe in teaching you responsibility, he began, his voice shifting into its all-too-familiar lecture mode. Giving you a handout right now would be the worst thing I could do. It would be enabling this lifestyle you've chosen. It would be a disservice to you. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I had expected a no, but I hadn't expected it to be wrapped in a cloak of paternal wisdom. It's not a handout, Dad. It's a loan. I'm your son, and I'm about to be homeless. And that's a tough lesson, he said, his voice unyielding. Sometimes, hitting rock bottom is the only thing that inspires a man to finally start building on solid ground. Look, I'll make some calls for you. I know some people in the marketing departments of real companies. I can get you an interview for a stable corporate job with a 401 kelvins. That's real help. That's a hand up, not a handout. He was offering me a solution, but it was his solution. A way to mold me into the son he wanted, using my desperation as his leverage. He wasn't saving me. He was trying to convert me. So, the answer is no? I asked, my voice flat. The answer, he said, his tone softening slightly, as if he was bestowing a great gift upon me, is that I'm offering you something far more valuable than money. I'm offering you a course correction. Think about my offer. When you're ready to get serious about your future, call me back. He hung up. I stood in the middle of my small apartment, the silence ringing in my ears. I hadn't just been refused. I had been dismissed, lectured, and my life's work had been invalidated in the space of a 5-minute phone call. The experiment had begun. The first test had yielded its result, and the cold, simmering resentment I'd been nursing for years began to burn a little hotter. The worst part was, a small, beaten-down part of me almost believed him. But then I remembered the $88 million sitting in a trust under a fake name. And I knew he wasn't just wrong about me. He was wrong about everything. After the call with my father, a profound and chilling sense of calm settled over me. His reaction wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation. It was the data point I needed to prove my hypothesis. The pain of his rejection was real, a familiar ache from a lifetime of falling short of his expectations. But it was now overlaid with the cold, detached perspective of a scientist observing a predictable reaction. He had performed exactly as I had anticipated. There was no rage, no shouting match, just the quiet, soul-crushing disappointment of a son realizing his father's love was conditional, tied inextricably to a version of success he could never, and now would never want to achieve. For an hour, I just sat on my worn-out sofa, tracing the patterns in the cheap rug and letting the reality of the conversation wash over me. He hadn't just said no. He had used my fabricated crisis as an opportunity to reinforce his narrative of my life. That I was a failure in waiting, and he was the ever-wise patriarch waiting for me to finally see the error of my ways. His offer of a real job was the ultimate power move, a way to rescue me on his terms, forever indebting me to his vision for my life. The experiment was working, but the validation felt hollow, tainted with a sorrow so deep it felt like it was part of my DNA. But I couldn't stop. The process had a momentum of its own now. The next name on my list was my brother, Mark. This call would be different. With my father, the rejection was paternal and ideological. With Mark, I knew it would be personal and competitive. Our entire lives had been an unspoken competition, one where he had always been given a head start and better equipment, and yet still acted as though he'd won through sheer merit. Contacting him required a different strategy. He rarely answered calls from me, preferring to let them go to voicemail so he could respond via text at his convenience, a subtle power play that established his time as more valuable than mine. So I sent him a text first. "Hey Mark, got a minute for a quick call? Something serious has come up." By framing it as serious, I was banking on his curiosity, or perhaps his morbid desire to hear about my latest misfortune. He responded almost immediately. "In a meeting." "What's up?" I texted back. "Can't do this over text. It's bad. Facing eviction." That got his attention. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. "An eviction? Seriously, Alex?" He began. No preamble, no "how are you?" His voice was a mixture of annoyance and a barely concealed, "I knew it. What the hell happened?" I gave him the same story I gave our father, but I tailored the details for him. I focused on the business aspects, the volatile nature of startup funding, the brutal contract terms for freelancers. I used language he would understand, hoping to appeal to the finance bro part of him that respected a narrative of market forces and calculated risks, even failed ones. I laid out the numbers, the lost income, the salary reduction, the precise amount I was short for rent. I tried to sound less like a panicking artist and more like a small businessman who had been screwed by a bad market. I was appealing to his logic, not his empathy, because I suspected he didn't have much of the latter to spare. When I finished, he let out a long, theatrical sigh. It was the sound of a man burdened by the incompetence of others. "Jesus. Alex. I mean, come on. We all told you this would happen. You can't build a life on passion projects. The real world has balance sheets and profit and loss statements, not just pretty pictures." It was my father's lecture, but stripped of the faux paternalistic concern and delivered with the cold, cutting edge of a rival. "I get it, Mark. You were right," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "But the lectures don't help me right now. I'm in a desperate situation. I need to borrow $7,500. I have a plan to get more clients. I'm working on it. But I just need a bridge. I need some runway to get through this." He actually laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh. Not overtly. It was a laugh of genuine, incredulous amusement. 7,500? "Alex, do you know what I could do with $7,500 in the market right now? That's a seed investment. That's a play on a high-yield bond. It's not just cash to be burned on your rent for a crappy apartment in Koreatown. It's not to be burned, Mark. It's to keep a roof over my head," I countered, my voice rising despite my efforts to keep it steady. "You know I'm good for it. I'll sign a contract. I'll pay you interest." "Oh, I'm sure you would," he said, the condescension dripping from every word. "Look, I feel for you, little brother. I really do. But this is a teachable moment. Money you don't earn yourself is poison. It makes you weak. It creates dependency. Dad and I, we built everything we have. We understand the value of a dollar because we fought for it. The hypocrisy was so staggering it left me speechless. He was talking about fighting for dollars from the comfort of an executive position that had been handed to him, from a life subsidized by family connections and inherited privilege. He had never known a single day of the kind of financial struggle I had faced every day for the last decade. He had no idea what it meant to fight. "So you're saying no?" I finally managed to say. "I'm saying I'm not going to enable your bad decisions," he corrected me, as if he were a therapist and not my brother. "But I'm not going to leave you completely high and dry." "I'll do you a favor." I waited, a flicker of misguided hope igniting in my chest. Maybe I had misjudged him. "I'll co-sign a loan for you," he announced magnanimously. "A bank loan. That way it's official. You'll be accountable to a real institution, not just me. It will build your credit and teach you about fiscal responsibility. I'll even make some calls to my guy at Wells Fargo, get you a decent rate." I saw the trap immediately. A co-signed loan would put me officially in his debt, but in a way that cost him nothing unless I defaulted. It would give him all the leverage and none of the risk. He would be my savior, my rescuer, but without having to actually sacrifice a single dollar of his own money. It was the most Mark Carter solution imaginable, a gesture that looked like help but was actually a calculated move to gain power and reinforce his superiority. "You'd co-sign a loan, but you wouldn't just lend me the money yourself?" I asked, needing to hear him say it plainly. "Exactly," he said, his voice bright and proud, as if he'd just solved a complex algorithm. "It's the smart play. For both of us. It protects our relationship from getting messy with money, and it forces you to level up, to deal with the real world." I thought about the $88 million sitting in the North Star Trust. I could buy the bank he was sending me to. I could buy his Porsche and his minimalist Malibu house. I could buy Carter Construction itself and demote him to fetching my coffee. The power I held was so immense, so absolute, and the contrast with the pathetic, powerless position he was putting me in was dizzying. "Mark?" I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Thanks for the offer. I'll think about it." "You do that, little brother," he said, his tone already shifting, his mind already moving on to his next meeting, his next deal. "Let me know when you're ready to put on your big boy pants. I've got to run. Good luck." The line went dead. I lowered the phone and stared at the brick wall outside my window. 2 for 2. My father had offered to re-engineer my life. My brother had offered me a leveraged form of indentured servitude. Neither had offered a shred of genuine, unconditional support. The image of the Carter family I had held in my head, a flawed but ultimately loving unit, was cracking under the pressure of this experiment, the fissures spreading with every call. And I still had one more person to test in the main family unit. The most unpredictable one of all. My sister, Chloe. This next call, I knew, wouldn't be about lectures or logic. It would be about emotion, and it was going to be the messiest one yet. The rejections from my father and brother were clean, sharp wounds. They were predictable, delivered with the cold precision of men who saw the world in black and white, success and failure. My call with my sister, Chloe, was different. It was a slow, messy unraveling, like pulling a thread on a cheap sweater until the whole thing falls apart in your hands. With Dad and Mark, I had to feign weakness and desperation. With Chloe, I barely had to act. My exhaustion and frustration were real, and she was an expert at sensing emotional vulnerability. She was the one member of my family who I had, on some level, a genuinely close relationship with, but it was a closeness built on a toxic foundation. My role as her perpetual savior. I knew this call would test not just her willingness to help, but the very nature of our bond. I gave myself a day to recover from the conversation with Mark before I contacted her. I needed to reset my emotional state. Chloe could smell insincerity from a mile away, but she was also a master of her own brand of it. I didn't call her. I drove to her apartment in Silver Lake. It was a tiny bohemian chic studio that cost far more than she could afford, a fact I was intimately familiar with, having helped her cover the rent 3 times in the past year. I needed to do this in person. I needed to see her face, to gauge her reaction without the filter of a phone. I brought coffee, a peace offering, and an old habit from our college days. I found her in the midst of a self-tape audition. Her living room transformed into a makeshift set with a ring light and a white sheet tacked to the wall. She was in the middle of a dramatic monologue, tears welling in her eyes on cue. She cut the recording as soon as she saw me. "Alex! Oh my God! What are you doing here?" she squealed, rushing over to hug me. The hug was warm and smelled of lavender essential oil. For a moment, it felt real. "Brought coffee," I said, handing her a cup. "And I needed to talk to you. It's not good." Her expression shifted instantly from cheerful sister to concerned empath, a role she played just as convincingly as the one in her monologue. We sat on her velvet couch, surrounded by crystals, tarot cards, and stacks of acting books. The whole place felt like a stage set for the character of struggling artist. "What's wrong?" she asked, her big, expressive eyes fixed on mine. "You look like you haven't slept in days." I told her the story for the 3rd time, but with her, I emphasized the emotional toll. I talked about the betrayal I felt from my client, the anxiety keeping me up at night, the shame of facing eviction. I painted a picture of creative and financial despair, a picture I knew she would recognize from her own life. I was speaking her language, the language of the struggling creative soul crushed by the indifferent machinery of capitalism. As I spoke, she nodded sympathetically, murmuring, "Oh, that's horrible, and I'm so sorry, Alex." She reached out and took my hand, her grip warm and reassuring. When I finally got to the part about needing the money, the $7,500, I let my voice drop to a near whisper. I told her I had already asked Dad and Mark, and that they had both said no. I was hoping this detail would trigger her own resentment towards them and position me as her fellow victim of their cold, unfeeling nature. Her reaction was instantaneous. "Of course they did," she seethed, her eyes flashing with anger on my behalf. "That is so typical. Dad with his lectures and Mark with his smug rich guy act. They have no idea what it's like for us, for the people who actually have to bleed for their art." She was on my side. The relief was so potent, so immediate, that I almost forgot I was acting. This was the Chloe I knew, the one who would rail against the injustices of the world with me, the one who understood what it felt like to be the family's creative outcast. "I know," I said, feeling a genuine wave of gratitude. "That's why I came to you. I didn't know who else to turn to." She squeezed my hand tighter. "I'm so glad you did. We have to stick together." For a moment, I thought this was it. I thought she was going to offer to help. I had miscalculated the entire experiment. My cynical predictions were wrong. But then came the pivot. It was subtle, a masterclass in emotional manipulation that I had witnessed many times before but had never seen so clearly. "God, this is it's a sign from the universe, you know," she said, her focus shifting from my problem to a grander, more cosmic interpretation of it. "The energy has been so blocked lately. My agent just dropped me. Did I tell you that? And my car just failed its smog check. It's going to be like $1,000 to fix. It feels like we're both being tested right now." And just like that, my crisis was no longer my own. It had been absorbed into her narrative, becoming a shared struggle. Except her struggles were suddenly taking center stage. "I'm sorry to hear that, Chloe," I said, my hope beginning to dwindle. "That's awful." "It is," she said, her voice catching. "And the thing is, I was just about to call you. I'm 3 weeks behind on my rent here. My landlord is being a total monster about it. I was going to ask if you could possibly help me out, just until I book this next commercial. And now you're in this position. It's like we're drowning together." She started to cry, real tears streaming down her face. It was a brilliant move. In the space of 30 seconds, she had transformed from my potential savior into my fellow victim, and then, subtly, into someone whose problems were even more immediate and dire than my own. She hadn't said no. She had simply made it impossible for me to even ask. I had no idea, I said, my own fabricated desperation feeling cheap and hollow in the face of her seemingly real-time crisis. Of course not, she sobbed. I try to be strong. I don't like to burden you. You're always the one taking care of everyone. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and pleading. Alex, what are we going to do? The "we" was the final, devastating blow. My request for $7,500 had been countered with her own implied, and much more emotionally charged, request for help. If I were to press my own case, I would look like a monster, ignoring her tears and her own impending homelessness to focus on my own selfish needs. She had completely flipped the script. I was no longer the one asking for help. I was once again in the position of being the one from whom help was expected. I don't know, Chloe, I stammered, completely outmaneuvered. I guess we'll figure something out. We will, she said, her tears subsiding as quickly as they had appeared, now that the threat of my request had been neutralized. We always do. She gave me another hug, this one feeling less like comfort and more like a dismissal. Listen, she said, pulling back and wiping her eyes. I have to finish this audition tape. It's due by 5. But let's talk tomorrow. We can brainstorm. Maybe we can start a GoFundMe. A joint one. I left her apartment and walked back to my car in a daze. My father had refused with a lecture. My brother had refused with a condescending business proposition. But my sister had refused by co-opting my crisis and making it her own. She had performed a kind of emotional jujitsu, using my own momentum against me to throw me off balance. It was, in its own way, the most sophisticated and most devastating rejection of all. It wasn't a no to my request for money, it was a no to the very idea that my problems could ever be more important than hers. I drove home through the LA traffic, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and purple. The experiment was 3 for 3. And the part of me that had hoped to be proven wrong, the part that had wanted my family to pass the test, was starting to die. I had one person left on my list, one final hope, my Uncle Ben. And if he failed the test too, I wasn't sure what I would do. There was a reason I saved my Uncle Ben for last. He was my Hail Mary, the final desperate hope that my cynical experiment would be proven wrong. Uncle Ben was my mother's older brother, and in the rigid, success-obsessed hierarchy of the Carter family, he was an anomaly. He wasn't a CEO or an executive. He was a retired carpenter who had spent 40 years building beautiful, sturdy things with his hands. He lived in the same small, unassuming house in a quiet, working-class suburb an hour east of Los Angeles that he'd bought with my aunt decades ago. After she passed away from cancer 5 years back, he'd stayed, surrounded by the ghosts of a happy life and the scent of sawdust that seemed permanently ingrained in the walls. He was the antithesis of my father. Where my father saw life as a ladder to be climbed, Uncle Ben saw it as a garden to be tended. He was a man of quiet integrity, deep kindness, and few words. He was the one who had taught me how to draw, sitting with me for hours at his worn wooden kitchen table, showing me how to see the shapes and shadows in things. He never judged my career choice. In fact, he was the only one who seemed to genuinely respect it. He had framed one of my early digital prints and hung it in his living room, right next to photos of his own children. In the Carter family, that was the equivalent of a knighthood. Contacting him felt different. There was no strategy, no script, no emotional calculation. I was just a nephew calling his uncle, and the shame I had to feign with the others was, in this case, terrifyingly real. The thought of lying to him, of manipulating his goodness for the sake of my experiment, filled me with a profound sense of self-loathing. I almost called it off. I could stop now, I told myself. I had my answers. My father, brother, and sister had all shown their true colors. But a deeper, more insistent part of me needed to know. I needed one point of light to prove that the darkness wasn't absolute. I needed to know if unconditional love actually existed in my world. I drove to his house on a Saturday morning. I didn't call first. I just showed up, the way I used to when I was a kid and needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere of my own home. His house was exactly as I remembered it. A modest, single-story home with a perfectly manicured lawn and a porch swing he had built himself. The old wind chimes, a gift from my aunt, tinkled softly in the breeze. He was in his workshop in the garage, a place that was more sacred to him than any church. I could hear the gentle rasp of a hand plane against wood as I walked up the driveway. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway. His face, weathered and kind, breaking into a genuine, warm smile. "Alex? What a surprise! To what do I owe the honor?" He put down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. He enveloped me in a hug that smelled of cedar wood and coffee. It was the first truly unconditional gesture of affection I had received in weeks, and I had to fight back a lump in my throat. "Just wanted to say hi, Uncle Ben," I said, my voice thicker than I intended. "It's been a while." He looked at me, his gaze sharp and perceptive. He saw things other people missed. "You look tired, kiddo," he said, his smile fading into concern. "More than tired. You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders. Come on inside. I'll make us some coffee." We sat at that familiar kitchen table, the sunlight streaming through the window and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The kitchen was old-fashioned but immaculately clean, a testament to his methodical nature. He placed a steaming mug in front of me and sat down, his presence calm and patient. He didn't press me. He just waited. He created a space for me to speak, a gift more valuable than any advice. And so, for the fourth and final time, I told my story. I told him about the freelance client, the bankruptcy, the cutbacks at work, the eviction notice. I stumbled through the words, the lie feeling heavier and more profane in his presence. The story that had sounded so plausible to the others now felt like a cheap, tawdry fiction. I was desecrating this peaceful, honest space with my elaborate deception. When I finished, he didn't sigh with disappointment like my father. He didn't laugh with condescending amusement like my brother. He didn't co-opt my pain like my sister. He just sat there for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought, his gaze fixed on my face. "That's a tough spot, Alex," he said finally, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "A real tough spot. I'm sorry you're going through that." He didn't offer a lecture. He didn't offer a business proposition. He just offered simple, unadorned sympathy. And it was devastating. "Have you told your dad?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Figured," he said with a sad, knowing sigh. "Richard's a good man in a lot of ways, but he sees problems as nails, and he's only got one hammer." That was the most succinct and accurate description of my father I had ever heard. He got up from the table and walked over to an old roll-top desk in the corner of the room, the one my aunt used to use to pay the bills. He unlocked a small drawer with a key he kept on his keychain. I could hear the rustling of papers. My heart started to pound. I didn't know what he was doing, but I had a sinking, terrible feeling. He came back to the table and sat down. He pushed a small, worn checkbook across the table towards me. "I don't have a whole lot, Alex," he said, his voice quiet and steady. "Your aunt's medical bills took most of our savings, and my pension isn't much. But I've got some." He paused, and his eyes met mine. They were clear and full of a profound, heartbreaking sincerity. "How much do you need?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and pure. I should have stopped. I should have ended the experiment right there, confessed everything, and begged for his forgiveness. But the part of me that had set this whole thing in motion, the cold, scientific part, needed to see it through to the end. The words felt like stones in my throat. 7,500. I whispered. He didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly, as if I had asked to borrow $20. He opened the checkbook, took out an old ballpoint pen, and began to write. The only sound in the room was the scratching of the pen on the paper. I watched his gnarled, carpenter's hands, hands that had built so much, now signing away a significant portion of what little he had left, without a moment's hesitation, without a single question about paying it back, without a word of judgment. He tore the check from the book with a soft, final rip and slid it across the table to me. I looked down. In his neat block handwriting it read, "Pay to the order of Alex Carter." The amount was for $8,000. "I made it a little extra," he said softly, as if he were embarrassed. "For groceries and gas. You can't look for work on an empty stomach." I stared at the check, my vision blurring with tears. This small piece of paper was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing I had ever seen. It was a testament to his love, and it was an indictment of my deception. The experiment was over. I had my answer. I had found the one person who would stand by me, the one person whose love wasn't a transaction. And in doing so, I had betrayed him in the most profound way imaginable. I opened my mouth to tell him, to confess everything, but the words wouldn't come. I just sat there, clutching the check in my hand, the weight of his kindness and my lie threatening to crush me completely. He had passed the test, but in the process, I had failed a much more important one. I left my Uncle Ben's house in a fugue state, the check for $8,000 clutched in my hand. It felt both sacred and profane, a symbol of his boundless generosity and my own wretched deceit. The drive back to Los Angeles was a silent, agonizing ordeal. Every traffic light, every billboard, every passing car seemed to mock me. The California sun, usually a source of comfort, felt harsh and accusatory. I had set out to expose the transactional nature of my family's love, and I had succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. But the victory felt like a defeat. The one pure, selfless relationship I had was now tainted by my lies, and the guilt was a physical presence, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I didn't cash the check. I couldn't. I placed it on my desk in my apartment, and it sat there like a silent accusation. It was more than just money. It was a piece of him, a tangible representation of his sacrifice. The following days were a study in misery. My $88 million secret felt less like a superpower and more like a curse. The elation of my win was gone, replaced by a profound sense of isolation. I had this incredible, world-altering power, but I couldn't share it with anyone. I had proven my family was exactly as selfish as I'd suspected, but the knowledge brought me no satisfaction, only a deep, abiding sorrow. The experiment had given me clarity, but it had come at the cost of my own integrity. I spent hours online, not looking at mansions or sports cars, but researching my Uncle Ben's financial situation. It wasn't hard to find. Public records, property taxes, the average pension for a union carpenter in his area, it all painted a clear and devastating picture. The $8,000 he had given me wasn't just some of his savings. Based on my calculations, it was nearly all of it. He had essentially handed over his entire emergency fund, the cushion that stood between him and financial disaster, without a second thought. Then I found something else, something that made the blood run cold in my veins. While searching for information, I stumbled upon a community health forum where, a few months prior, someone with his name and from his town had been asking questions about the costs of new generation hearing aids, lamenting that his insurance wouldn't cover the model his audiologist recommended. The cost he mentioned was just shy of $10,000. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. He hadn't just given me his savings. He had given me the money he was saving for something he desperately needed, something that would drastically improve his quality of life. He had chosen my well-being over his own, sacrificing his ability to hear the world clearly so that I could have a roof over my head. The thought hit me like a physical blow. I had to go to the bathroom and retch, my body rebelling against the toxicity of my own actions. My father, with his multi-million-dollar company, wouldn't spare a dime. My brother, with his six-figure salary and stock options, offered only a co-signed loan. My sister, who had received thousands from me over the years, countered with her own manufactured crisis. But my uncle, a retired carpenter living on a fixed income, had quietly handed over the money he needed for his own health. That was the breaking point. The experiment had to end. The secrecy, at least with him, had to be broken. I couldn't live with this lie for one more day. I owed him the truth. No matter how painful or humiliating it would be for me, I needed his forgiveness, even though I knew I didn't deserve it. I called him and asked if I could come over that evening, my voice shaking so much I could barely get the words out. He simply said, "Of course, kiddo. The door's always open." The drive back to his house that evening was the longest of my life. I had the uncashed check in my pocket, along with another, much larger check, drawn from the first account I had set up with my winnings. It was a cashier's check, an anonymous instrument that wouldn't betray my secret to the world, but would, I hoped, begin to set things right with him. I found him on his porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. He had a glass of iced tea in his hand. He smiled as I approached, but his eyes were full of a gentle concern. "You look even worse than you did on Saturday," he said, his voice soft. I couldn't even manage a smile. I sat down next to him on the swing, and for a long moment, we just sat in silence, the swing creaking rhythmically. "Uncle Ben," I began, my voice cracking, "I have to tell you something, and it's the hardest thing I've ever had to say." I pulled his check out of my pocket and handed it back to him. "I can't take this. I never should have asked for it." He looked at the check, then back at me, his expression confused. "Alex, we're family. Family helps family. There's no shame in it." "No," I said, shaking my head as the tears I'd been holding back finally began to fall. "That's not it. The story I told you, about losing my client, about the eviction, none of it was true. I made it all up." He just stared at me, his kind face a mask of bewilderment. He didn't look angry, just profoundly confused. "I don't understand," he said. "Why would you do that?" And so, I told him everything. I told him about the lottery, the $88 million, the crushing paranoia, the feeling of being underestimated my entire life. I told him about the cold, calculating experiment I had designed to test my family's love. I confessed my conversations with my father, my brother, and my sister, laying out their rejections in stark detail. I didn't spare myself. I painted myself as the villain I felt I was. Manipulative, deceitful, and cruel. I told him he was the final part of the test, and that his goodness had broken me. When I was finished, the sun had set, and we were sitting in the twilight. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and my own ragged breathing. He was silent for a long, long time. He just looked out at the darkening street, his hands resting on his knees. I waited for his anger, for his disappointment, for him to tell me to get out of his house and never come back. I had betrayed his trust in the most fundamental way, and I deserved his wrath. But when he finally turned to me, his eyes weren't angry. They were filled with a deep, weary sadness. "Oh, Alex," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "What have they done to you? What have they done to make you feel like you had to go to such lengths to find out if you were loved?" He wasn't mad at me. He was mad at them. He saw past my deception to the years of pain that had fueled it. He saw the wounded child who had orchestrated this whole, terrible play. In that moment, his empathy, his ability to see the why behind my monstrous what, was a greater gift than any amount of money. It was absolution. "I am so sorry, Uncle Ben," I whispered, my voice choked with tears. "I am so, so sorry." "I know you are," he said, and he put his arm around my shoulder, pulling me into a one-armed hug, just like he did when I was a kid who had scraped his knee. "You made